Hey folks, KR King here, helping one and all homebrew their own D&D campaign. So this weekend I'm going to Grand Con, and I'm going to be playing D&D and talking to people about D&D all weekend long. So this is a video I'm just trying to make between visits to the convention. Today's topic is specialty weapons. And by specialized, I mean those weapons that don't appear in the player's handbook, weapons inventory, or any of the other publications. So what I'm going to do is go over how to integrate these specialized weapons into your campaign without hurting game balance. The key here is to think about a storyline behind them, honor the traditions from which they came, and just avoid the temptation to have scope creep. And there's a point of order here. These used to be called exotic weapons, and I use sneer marks there because, in fact, many of the exotic weapons of D&D, say the katana, which was used in medieval Japan as a samurai weapon, wasn't exotic at all to the Japanese. The longsword would be exotic. And this, some people say, oh, this is why they don't include these in the 5th edition weapons list, or they just integrate everything under the longsword or short sword or something like that. I actually think it's more about simplifying everything in terms of what 5e was trying to do. And I say that because there are exotic weapons like the cat of nine tails or the blackjack that aren't included either, and those are from the cultural background that a lot of times people think of classic D&D. So I'm just going to use the term specialized and move on. And for the purposes of this video, I'm going to be using statistics that my longtime viewer, Matt Nerdy, came up with. He combs through old 1st and 2nd edition manuals, modules, supplemental books. He finds these weapons. He has his own methodology that he uses to come up with a conversion stats for 5e. Thing is, you can find all these weapons, 10 different versions of this online. Maybe you've made your own. And I'm not saying Matt's numbers are the be-all, end-all. In fact, at the end of the video, I'll talk about a few of the statistics he gives out that I would change this and that. But here's the thing. I love it when someone else does the math for me. And I think oftentimes, not only does Matt have his numbers pretty close, but he comes up with some cool abilities and stuff based on his research. So what I'm going to do I'm going to talk about the basic ideas that I use when thinking about how do I integrate specialized weapons into my campaign. Then I'm going to go through specific examples from Matt's list. As I said, he has 40 plus. I will include the full list down in the description below, so check that out. All right, so the first method of integrating specialized weapons into your campaign is very obvious. You just include it on the list, standard list of weapons that they have. They can either buy at the outset or have as their standard package. Now, the issue here is if this weapon has some damage capability that's more than the standard, say, longsword or finesse weapon, short sword, rapier, or something like that, everyone is going to just pick this. You can make them much more expensive, but unless they're absurdly expensive, like some ultra rare magic item, eventually the players are going to get enough gold to buy one, and so will everyone else. And this points out to this tendency to unbalance the game whenever we introduce homebrewed items or spells or abilities, because from the very beginnings of D&D, we were always researching new specialized weapon we could introduce, because in those days the lists were really short. So we'd look up historical examples and say, hey, let's include this. But the thing is, it's that inherent tendency you have when homebrewing to make the specialized weapon better than the traditional ones. It does more damage, it's more easily wielded, quicker to do something, whatever it was. And this was only compounded when you made them magical and we put abilities in. But the issue was, if you were going to go through all this work to make the specialized weapon, and then it just does the same thing as a standard weapon, there's something sort of unsatisfying about that. Just different in name only. So that's why it can be really fun to introduce exotic weapons with a storyline behind them. And the easiest storyline is one word: rarity. Because players love nothing more than to find some item, device, or weapon that is totally unique in the world. They're the only ones that have it. They go to some forgotten tomb or some far-off region and find this thing. It's just cool. And you could say, well, this is enough. It's super rare. It's the only one of its kind. And I'll just put it on the standard weapon charts. I'll use the same dexterity versus strength in terms of damage, the damage type of piercing, slashing, bludgeoning, but it's just kind of a cool item. But the thing is, if this is truly a one-of-a-kind or extremely rare item, there is that temptation to make it an integral part of some storyline. Say there's a carving in the hilt that is the only way you press this into a stone tablet and it opens the doors to a forgotten tomb, right? Or, this sword, you wave it over this portal and it opens the gateway to a dimension, but only under a blood moon. So it has a unique purpose based on its provenance that forwards a storyline, or it gives the players an advantage in some point along the adventure. They use it as a calling card, or there's something written there that they can use, to answer some riddle or question, so that you're giving them this advantage in this specific situation, but you're not unbalancing the course of the game by having something happen every time they fight with the weapon. Having said all that, another thing you can do if you've got a super rare item is you say, okay, it's going to be magical +1, +2, depending on the level of magic in your world. Or you could simply say, well, because of its rarity, it does in fact do more damage than the standard weapon, whether it's strength or dex based. So it sort of becomes like a magic item, but it's not magic, so that creatures that can only be hit by enchanted items, they don't get any bonus there. All right, so let's look now at some of the items that Matt provides on his list and see how these concepts play into introducing this item, and if it does have usually more power than its equivalent, how you justify that without imbalancing your game. So the first is the tachi, which is the classical weapon of the Japanese samurai period. This predates the katana, which came to replace it. And the tachi were the ultimate swords created by the greatest swordsmen of Japan. In fact, to this day, it is considered one of the finest blades ever produced. And as such, Matt has pegged their damage at 1d10 when used with one hand, 1d12 two-handed, whereas the katana has the same 1d8 damage, 1d10 that the longsword has. Now, what Matt does is he makes the katana cost 15 gold pieces and the tachi costs 100 gold. That's more than 7 times the amount. But as I said, depending on how much gold you have in your world, the players are going to get this and have enough money to buy a tachi if you just have them available. So I would use rarity and storyline to control this item. The techniques used to create the tachi in real life was a closely held secret, only known by a few master sword makers. So this could justify an extreme price barrier to buy one, even if you stumble across someone who has one, because they're very rare. And being a fantasy world, you could have the techniques for making a tachi have been long lost, such that there's only a few left in the world. Another thing is that the tachi was highly revered in medieval Japan, and I think that reverence in a fantasy setting lends itself to mystical power or also sentience. Now, I'm going to be doing a video shortly here on sentient swords. It's something we used to have in old D&D all the time, and they still have them today, but you don't get that much instruction. But here's an example of a sword. If it were sentient, I think it would have a very strong personality. It would have certain types of fighters that it would want to work for or work with. You could use an alignment factor or something else. The other thing is it's going to be very strong-willed. And in a similar fashion, Matt has the wakizashi, which is the short sword version of the katana. It does 1d8 as opposed to 1d6 for a standard short sword using the finesse capabilities. So here again, to justify that, you make it rare or expensive, a very specialized weapon. All right, so going down Matt's list, we have the Flamberge. This is the classical wavy sword, hence the French word, which I'm probably mispronouncing, but basically which means flame blade. And you can find videos on YouTube which demonstrate the incredible cutting abilities of a Flamberge. And the reason for this is when you have the waves, the point of contact, either on the top of the wave or the back or front side, creates much more impact than the long cutting surface of a longsword. This is basically the principle too behind the curved sword. So Matt has the Flamberge doing 1d10 as a two-handed weapon, but having seen these videos and done a little research, I might make that free. Wielding it with one hand, 1d12 with two hands. And the reason I'm willing to do this is the Flamberge had some historical drawbacks that made it not the go-to weapon of medieval times. First of all, it was very difficult to sheathe and unsheathe with the wavy, much wider form. And this meant it took a little bit longer to pull out, and a few seconds can make a huge difference in combat. The other thing was the complex geometry made it difficult to make and more expensive and difficult to maintain, because you had to have somebody that knew how to, sharpen that on the different points along the wavy form. So if you're out in the field, you may not have anyone available who knows how to sharpen a flamberge. And, sword sharpening is something in D&D that we just have as a background activity. We just assume that it occurs. But if you've got a weapon that has to have a specialized person to do that, you may decide after a certain amount of time or a certain number of battles, whatever you decide, and the players come along and they don't have anybody. Now the sword is dull, and now maybe it just does standard longsword damage. Just another way of controlling the scope creep. All right, another cool specialized weapon that Matt's done the stats for is the Macho Heat, which Matt calls the Macha. And by the way, I looked it up and the L at the end is silent. So the Macho Heat is a club-shaped weapon shaped like a paddle that has obsidian blades placed on either side of the paddle. And these blades are razor sharp. And I mean real sharp. The blades were inserted along the paddle either right next to each other or somehow staggered, or they were placed with a little bit of gap between them. And the Macho Heat was made as either a one-handed or two-handed weapon. And these are the classical weapons of Mesoamerican cultures like the Aztecs, the Mayas, and others. So Matt has the Macho Heat doing bludgeoning and slashing damage, 1d4 bludgeoning, 1d4 slashing. Now, this can be good or bad. If you have some resistance or whatever to one of these types, you're not going to do as much, but creatures that you can do both, you're rolling 2 dice. It's always better. You can't roll a 1. Now, in reality, the Macho Heat had some real drawbacks as opposed to steel swords. A club takes a little bit longer to swing than a sword, and those few seconds can make a big difference in a battle. The obsidian blades could shatter when they hit steel swords or plate armor, and they were very ineffective against chainmail. Now, in D&D, you have a fantasy world. You may just decide, I want the Macho Heat. I don't care. I'm just going to eliminate that. Just have it, operate like any other weapon. Or, maybe you increase it 1d6, 1d6, but you say, hey, it has these issues. You're slightly slower. You're always going to be a little bit off on your initiative or something like that. Or you have to go and fix the obsidian blades. Can you find them? That sort of thing. All right, and the final weapon I'm going to cover is the sap, which is basically the blackjack. And this was a classic weapon of thieves and, assassins or, whoever knocks somebody out, rob them, impress them into a navy. And what's interesting here is Matt doesn't give a damage roll on the sap. Instead, what he says is if someone's helping, I suppose grappling or something like that, or you sneak up behind someone and surprise them, you hit them, there's a chance you can either stun them or knock them unconscious. They get a save for this. I think it's a con save. If they fail by more than 5, they're knocked out. And I urge you to look over the numbers that Matt provides in terms of the DC of this and the mechanism for how it operates. You may want to do it differently, but the thing is, I think this is a really cool idea. So there you have some specialty weapons integrated in your campaign and ideas on how to introduce them and prevent some imbalance issues. As I mentioned, I'm going to put the whole list of Matt's calculations here in the description below. And as I said, I don't necessarily agree with all his numbers. I think that he's got the greater scimitar as being 12 pounds. I think that's a little heavy unless it's a sort of a giant item. He's got the hook sword as it's really cool. You can, instead of doing damage, you can knock someone prone. But I think maybe they'd get a dex save or something on that. But again, these are just little quibblings. I haven't used these actual weapons as per Matt's number, so I'd have to see. And he may say, hey, you're right. You play with these however you want. All right, so I'm heading back to Grand Con, but thanks for watching. If you like my content, please subscribe to my channel. I'm always looking for more. Please leave some comments because I love to read them and to respond. But most importantly, like I will be doing all weekend long, keep playing D&D and tell somebody else about it.